Will Michigan quarterback J.J. McCarthy rise up to be the Falcons' next franchise quarterback, or is he too similar to their last one in Desmond Ridder?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with a winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for far too long, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast that makes it your first listen or your first watch of the day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we will answering a later listener question that's been, at the bottom of the mailbag for basically a month about if there's any sort of worthwhile lessons that we can learn in terms of evaluating quarterbacks from this postseason. But we'll get started with a mock draft Monday, our first truly fully official mock draft Monday of the offseason. We've dabbled with some mock drafts and whatnot over the last month or two, I think going back to even the bye week in November. But we'll be breaking down Ben Solak's mock draft of the Ringer, and we'll focus primarily on his pick for the Atlanta Falcons to start things off, but we'll look at some of the other picks a little bit later. But, he had the Bears taking Caleb Williams, quarterback out of USC, number 1, Washington, and number 2 taking Jaden Daniels, quarterback out of LSU, 3, New England taking Drake May, quarterback, North Carolina, 4, Arizona taking Marvin Harrison, wide receiver, Ohio State, 5, the Chargers taking Joe Alt, offensive tackle, Notre Dame. 6, the Giants taking Rome Odunze, the wide receiver out of Washington. 7, the Titans taking Olu Fashanu, the offensive tackle from Penn State. 8, the Falcons snagging J.J. McCarthy, the quarterback out of Michigan. 9, the Bears getting Malik Nabers, the wide receiver out of LSU. And 10, the Jets getting Brock Bowers, the tight end out of Georgia. So, as I said, we'll analyze some of those other picks a little bit later, but let's talk about J.J. McCarthy, right? And we talked about, I think, almost exactly a month ago on this podcast when we were breaking down the quarterback position from 2023, mentioned how J.J. McCarthy had the potential to rise up boards and could potentially be the Falcon selection at 8 a month ago. And so anybody that's an everydayer of this podcast, seeing a mock draft that has the Falcons selecting McCarthy at 8 isn't shocking based off of the rhetoric you've heard on this podcast for the last 4 weeks, including having Trevor Sikkema of Pro Football Focus on the pod early last week talking about J.J. McCarthy's potential rise as well. So, in addition to that, the Locked On Falcons insiders also saw me break down J.J. McCarthy's film last week, right? This week, they also saw me break down Caleb Williams' film. And next week, they'll see Drake May. And then the week after that, Jaden Daniels. I've already done Michael Penix Jr. out of Washington, the quarterback there. And so if you want to become a Locked On Falcons insider, you'll get access to all these film breakdowns of these various prospects all off season long, I should say, as well as potentially the film breakdowns during the upcoming season. But you also get one-on-one access with me. And all you got to do to become a Locked On Falcons insider is hit that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. And you get 14 days free, right, when you sign up, right? So that means you're going to get Caleb Williams, Drake May, and Jaden Daniels for free if you sign up today, all right? And then you can decide whether after that 14-day free trial, whether or not you want to keep subscribing for $4.99 a month after that point. So go check it out if you're interested in my sort of film breakdown of J.J. McCarthy. But basically, if you decide not to sign up, in general, I have a positive opinion of J.J. McCarthy. He's grown on me over the course of this cycle. That's kind of been the through line for a lot of people. It's like, oh, like I watched J.J. McCarthy expecting a certain thing, and he kind of grew on me the more and more I watched him. But I know as I've mentioned several times on the podcast, he's going to be polarizing, especially the Falcon fans, because I think in a lot of ways, the selling points on JJ McCarthy are going to be very similar to the selling points that the Falcons were pushing a year ago on Desmond Ridder, right? The Falcons and myself on this podcast, right? And you look at what JJ McCarthy was able to do at Michigan this past year. In a lot of ways, it was very reminiscent of what we thought Desmond Ridder would be able to do in Atlanta this past year, right? Asking him to manage a game. It's an offense that's built around the run game, right? Two-headed backfield at Michigan, two-headed backfield in Atlanta, two good tight ends as well at Michigan, one good receiver, same thing here in Atlanta. And JJ McCarthy in that offense was able to make the plays that guided Michigan to an undefeated national championship season. Meanwhile, Desmond Ridder was not able to make the plays to guide the Falcons to the postseason berth. But both guys weren't carrying their offense. You know, you're hoping that JJ McCarthy can do more of that as an upgrade over Desmond Ridder. And there's potential there with JJ McCarthy. He's young, right? He showed a lot of growth from his true sophomore year in 2022 to his true junior year this past year in 2023. You like to see that. We didn't really see Desmond Ridder make that, you know, a comparable jump until his junior to senior year at Cincinnati. And so if you're looking at that as a one-to-one, it's like, okay, it is a little bit more promising to see JJ McCarthy make a similar jump from a sophomore to junior year at a younger age. And that's going to be one of the selling points with JJ McCarthy, his youth, right? He just finished his age 20 season. He turned 21 back in January, and Ridder just completed his age 24 season in the NFL. And it's basically begs the question, okay, what is JJ McCarthy going to be in 3 years when he's 24? And it's the idea of, with NFL development, working in an NFL offense, all that stuff, that he's going to be significantly a better prospect at 24 than Desmond Ridder was at the same age this past year, right? That's kind of the selling point on JJ McCarthy. But you know, it does raise concerns about upside and ceiling and all that stuff. And I wouldn't necessarily project JJ McCarthy to be a top 5 pick. I would probably project him probably at best in that sort of maybe a borderline top 10 guy in that 8 to 12 range that Matt Ryan made a career out of being. It's the same sort of ceiling I projected for Desmond Ridder ultimately when he is fully developed in terms of what I thought he could be as well. Obviously, we're probably not in that timeline where Desmond Ridder turned into that. You know, that's an alternate reality in that regard. But I think in a similar ways with Desmond Ridder, if you're betting on JJ McCarthy, you're betting on the person, right? You're betting on, you know, the intangibles, right? Because you're not going to sit there and watch the film and see all these tangible things. They're like, oh, JJ McCarthy does X, Y, and Z at an extremely high level. It's a lot of intangible stuff. And that was, you know, the thing that the Falcons were pushing last year with Desmond Ridder. You know, I think McCarthy's intriguing in for similar reasons. You know, you have a relatively blank slate and you've seen flashes, especially this past year, but it's going to beg the question of nature versus nurture, right? The nature of JJ McCarthy, is he sort of got that competitive drive in him, that sort of intangible quality that you look for, that alpha, whatever leader, whatever you want to call it, that, you know, is innate to quarterbacks, right? You know, in the same way that a Joe Burrow is, in the sense that Joe Burrow isn't necessarily the most physically gifted quarterback on the planet when you just watch him, but, you know, he has other things that he's able to do. Not to say that Joe Burrow has like poor tools or anything like that. You know, he's an incredibly accurate quarterback, but that's a separate conversation. But, you know, that's sort of the questions about JJ McCarthy. Does he have that similar nature, right? And then when you look at the nurture aspect of it, if you're the Falcons or really any team, whether it's the Falcons or somebody else, like you're betting on that we're going to have the environment that's going to be able to foster whatever that nature is that JJ McCarthy seemingly may or may not possess. And so that is going to be the big question with JJ McCarthy. And that's why it's going to be, he's probably going to be a harder sell for a lot of folks, because compared to other quarterbacks, right? Like you know, I can't sit here and come on a podcast and be like, oh, you know, I know all these things about JJ McCarthy. Like you're not going to be able to tell that. That's why they're intangible, so to speak. So he's a projection. It makes him, you know, a little bit more riskier than maybe some other guys that where they have that clear-cut, tangible skill set that you say that's special, that's unique, that's great, you know, which is, I think, what we would say about the top 3 quarterbacks in this draft class. But that's going to be a hard selling point. Now, again, I think JJ McCarthy is a realistic option. I've mentioned before that I think he's got plan C for the Falcons potentially. Again, it's early in the process. We'll see how it all plays out. But if you've missed those episodes when we talked about what the various Falcons plans are, again, this is just my guess, my semi-educated guess at this point in time in the offseason. But I think plan A would be to try to trade up for one of those top 3 quarterbacks. Plan B would be potentially landing Kirk Cousins should he become available. But there's certainly a reality where the Falcons aren't able to trade up to get their plan A, and Kirk Cousins stays in Minnesota or goes elsewhere if he does hit the market. And so plan B falls flat. And then I think in that scenario, JJ McCarthy is going to be plan C, the next plan, over, say, a plan D that I've mentioned before, like Justin Fields, trading for Justin Fields. And that personally, and again, I'm sure many of you guys will disagree with this assessment, and I'm sure I'll see it in the comments and elsewhere. I personally like betting on JJ McCarthy more than I like betting on Justin Fields for, reasons that I think McCarthy probably has a better chance of being a top 15, top 12-ish quarterback than Justin Fields does at this point in time. Again, we don't know what JJ McCarthy is going to be, but like the unknown is much more tantalizing to me than what we know about Justin Fields, is basically what I'm saying. And then you get 3+ years potentially to develop JJ McCarthy versus 1 year of hoping it all comes together for Justin Fields in a type of offense that traditionally, and again, we don't know 100% certain what type of offense Zach Robinson is going to run, but if it's similar to the McVay Rams offense, that has historically been an offense that Justin Fields has struggled in, which is, a pass heavy offense that likes to attack the middle of the field. And those are not the strengths of Justin Fields' offense. Like if you're going to build an offense around Justin Fields, it's going to be a run heavy offense that, ideally wants to attack the perimeter of the field. But speaking of attacking the perimeter of the field, one potential option for the Falcons beyond JJ McCarthy that, Ben Solak's mock draft could have the Falcons going after, especially if plan A or plan B come to fruition, would be taking a wide receiver like Malik Nabers that could absolutely attack the perimeter of a football field. And that, as well as some other alternative options in terms of potentially taking the best defensive player off the board, is something that we'll explore as we continue today's Mock Draft Monday. So football season is over, which means basketball season is here to stay, and it is time to get buckets over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your first bet wins, and you can bet on your favorite NBA or NCAA teams or players with quick bets, live same game parlays, exclusive player props, and so much more. All you have to do is visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to sign up. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to shoot your shot. FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NBA. So continuing today's Locked On Falcons, I want to plug the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel here on YouTube, the first of its kind, giving you all the local expertise that Locked On is famous for, as well as covering the biggest stories for all the national leagues and national shows, all on one platform. Check it out on YouTube or Amazon Fire TV. And if you're looking for more local flavor, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta's 24/7 streaming channel here on YouTube as well. So looking at Ben's other mock draft, and now we'll get into analyzing the rest of the top 10 that is interesting, right? Probably the first thing that stands out is having Jaden Daniels being selected over Drake May, #2 overall for the Commanders. And I'm sure Locked On Commanders can certainly provide a lot more insight into the viability of this, but certainly that has been something that has been gathering more steam lately. Personally, and again, these aren't final evaluations, but at least, probably over the next 2 or so weeks, I'll probably get like 80 to 90% towards final evaluation of these quarterbacks. But, right now for me personally, I think the gap, I think Jaden Daniels is closer to JJ McCarthy from a talent standpoint, maybe not from a talent, as a prospect, than he is to Drake May. And so if the Commanders do wind up taking Daniels #2, to me, that would be a major reach personally, but it's going to be an interesting offseason, right? And, that potentially opens the door to Drake May to fall out of the top 3, especially if New England decides to go in a different direction or wants to pick up the phone to pick up, for a trade, I'm not going to be complaining about that. Although later in the episode, we'll talk about why trading up isn't necessarily historically that successful, but we'll save that to later. But certainly I would be very intrigued by Drake May, trading up for Drake May. That would make my dreams come true. Someone, I know we've done a lot of Kirk Cousins content on the podcast, and I know one person watching the episodes came to the conclusion that Kirk Cousins would be my preferred choice. He wouldn't be. But Drake May would be my preferred choice, right? No, Caleb Williams would technically be my preferred choice for the Falcons' next quarterback, but I know there's a 0.0001% chance of that happening. At least with Drake May, at least theoretically, it's like a 12% chance that he could be the next Falcons quarterback. So that seems at least a lot more plausible to me in terms of realistic options for the Falcons. But that's a conversation for a future day. Now, looking at the rest of Ben Solak's mock, the first 4 picks seem to be the consensus on the majority of mocks. It's going to be Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Drake May, and Marvin Harrison Jr. in some order, right? Now, number 5, Ben has the Chargers, probably the next curveball after taking Jaden Daniels over Drake May, which is what the point of all that to say was. I don't think that's as big a curveball today as it might have seemed a month ago. And we'll see if that continues to be a curveball. But the next big curveball is having the Chargers take a tackle in Joe Alt. And I know the majority of mocks up to now have had the Chargers taking a pass catcher, but I do think with the hiring of Jim Harbaugh, the chances of them going O-line at 5 shot up tremendously. And then the other thing that stood out about Ben's mock, and this is probably going to be pretty common for a lot of mocks this offseason, are all 10 of the top 10 players selected are offensive players. And we mentioned before in talking about the Falcons' potential options in round 1 is that the Falcons are probably the best bet to be the first team to take a defensive player off the board. That it's very likely that the first 7 picks are going to be offensive players, but we'll see how, that shakes out. And for in Ben's mock, the first defensive player was pick number 11. That was the Minnesota Vikings selecting Toledo cornerback Quinyon Mitchell. And if you guys recall, a couple of weeks ago, we spent a lot of time talking about Quinyon Mitchell as one of the standouts of the Senior Bowl. If there was one player that stood out the most at the Senior Bowl, it was arguably Quinyon Mitchell, who was like, I would have personally argued was the practice player of the week, if you ask me. But what's interesting in this mock draft is even though the offense dominates the top 10, the defense dominates the middle 10, right? 7 of the next 10 picks, starting with pick 11, wind up being defensive players. And that includes Dallas Turner, the edge rusher out of Alabama, who Ben has going 16 to Seattle, but we've mentioned before as a guy that could potentially be the first defensive player off the board for the Falcons at pick 8. And I'm expecting once we get past the combine, Turner will sort of become the consensus edge 1 in this draft class over players like Alayatu Latu of UCLA and Jared Verse of Florida State. I think Ben had Latu going 1 or 2 spots ahead of Turner in this draft, and Verse I think was like 22 in his mock or something like that. But we talked a little bit briefly about Dallas Turner, and I'm sure we'll talk plenty more about him over the next 2+ months, and his fit as a sort of edge rusher in this 3-4 scheme. Now, there is an argument, beyond just edge rusher, that the Falcons could go defense and take a cornerback at 8, right? With Mitchell potentially as an option, Alabama cornerback Terrion Arnold, who goes 12 in Ben's mock right after Mitchell. I don't know if there's a particularly strong argument, at least sitting here today, that the Falcons could take a quarterback in the top 10. Given that the expectation, and we'll see if this lives up to reality, but the expectation is that this defensive scheme under Jimmy Lake and Raheem Morris is going to feature a lot more zone coverage than the defensive scheme of Ryan Nielsen. And if you guys recall from previous off seasons when Dean Pease was the D coordinator here and people were mocking the Falcons to take a cornerback high in round 1, I was sort of reluctant because I just don't think zone heavy teams put that much of a premium on, having that lockdown number 2 corner that you would typically target with a top 10 pick, which is going to be typically those guys are going to be high level man cover corner guys. And so I'm expecting this defense stylistically under Morris and Lake to be much more similar to the Dean Pease style defense, not just because they're running a 3-4 front, but just in terms of what they want to do from a scheme standpoint in a coverage standpoint. So we'll see whether or not the Falcons need at corner picks up. They do have a need at that position, given open question marks there with Jeff Okudah's future and Clark Phillips and whoever else. But we'll see if that basically picks up, after free agency. Like I think in March we'll have a better idea of what the Falcons' plan is going to be at the cornerback position once we get through there over the next month or so. But the other player that's worth picking up, mentioning as a potential Falcons option at 8 is Malik Nabers, who went 9 in Ben's mock. And, I think it's very easy to imagine an alternate scenario where the Falcons do solidify their quarterback position in March with an addition like Kirk Cousins or Russell Wilson or Justin Fields or whoever else that the Falcons think they should target over JJ McCarthy. And if the draft were to fall the way that Ben projects it, the Falcons could be taking Malik Nabers at 8 over JJ McCarthy. And I think that would be a home run pick, right? I don't know exactly when the first time Malik Nabers' name was dropped on this illustrious podcast. My guess is it was probably like in May or June of last year when we were indulging in our Corey Davis watch, right? And like, if I didn't mention him on the podcast, I was certainly thinking about him while I was talking about those things, because it was way back then that I was like looking at him as a future Falcon, right? I remember the day that Corey Davis retired back in August or whenever that was, September. And like my first tweet after that was like, hey, have you guys watched Malik Nabers? Right. Like it immediately was like, we went from Corey Davis watch to Malik Nabers watch, at least in my mind. And so like since over that time, 6+ months, whatever it's been, I've generally considered him to be a perfect number 2 wide receiver for this offense, right? Not only do you get the vertical threat that he can provide with his speed, but he's also a guy that's very dangerous with the ball in his hands and, can take quick slants and turn them into 20+ yard gains. And when you think about how Arthur Smith utilized Calvin Ridley back in 2021, which was a lot of sort of like shallow crossing routes, drag routes and whatnot, like Malik Nabers would be perfect in that sort of role. Now, obviously Arthur Smith is no longer here. And obviously I don't know if we'd be looking at Malik Nabers as a number 2 receiver, but in fact, a number 1 receiver now, especially coming off the monster 2023 season that he had. So good, in fact, that I think I've seen people debate on who's the best LSU wide receiver, Odell Beckham Jr., Jamar Chase, or Malik Nabers. And I think there's a legitimate argument to be made that Malik Nabers could be, the best in that group, or at least the best college player of that group. But, I know taking Nabers at 8 is going to be criticized by certain people within the fan base, especially those that have not been happy with the Falcons' investment in skill position players. But at least this time, I would imagine that's only going to happen if the Falcons find at least a decent answer at the quarterback position first and foremost, like we're talking about with Fields or Cousins or somebody else along those lines. So we'll see. I know my guy Jarvis Davis will be inconsolable if they take a offensive player that high, but that's just the way it is. And the way we'll wrap up today's episode is by getting into a listener question about whether or not there's some shift in how we should evaluate quarterbacks based off of this past year's postseason results. And we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, comedy, music, and theater near you. They have killer last-minute deals, and so you can buy tickets in seconds right up to the start of an event. All-in prices mean you're not going to get hit with hidden fees. To see the view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. And don't forget Game Time's guarantee, which means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, they'll credit you 110% the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app. Create an account, use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So wrapping up today's episode, we have a listener question from the Discord. It comes from Donnelly, and he asked this question on January 16th. So it was buried at the bottom of the mailbag. He asks, seeing how the likes of Goff, Love, and Purdy are still in the playoffs, is there some sort of shift going on in the NFL where the way we analyze quarterbacks is now no longer as accurate? Or is it the supporting cast in the NFL today more important than it used to be? Would we be better off just drafting 2 quarterbacks with late round picks and signing a veteran to mentor them instead of trying to do some blockbuster trade to move up? So a lot of things in there. The quick answer is no, I don't think there's been a shift. The second answer is I think supporting cast is just as important today as it has always been. This is a team sport, right? We like to make it about the quarterback, but it's still a team sport. And that was true in 2002 just as much as it's true in 2024. As for trading up, I think you can make a compelling argument that trading up isn't worthwhile given the relatively low hit rate of a quarterback, right? We'll probably explore this more in depth further in the offseason. But if you look at the last decades of quarterback trade ups, right, on draft day, right, in terms of pre-draft trades, right, that happened before the day of the draft or the night of the draft, over the last decade, you have Bryce Young last year, Trey Lance in 2021, Sam Darnold in 2018, Jared Goff, and Carson Wentz in 2016. Not a great hit rate, right, in terms of pre-draft. Now, day of draft trades, you have 2021 Justin Fields, 2020 Jordan Love, 2018 Josh Allen and Josh Rosen and Lamar Jackson, 2017 Mitch Trubisky, Patrick Mahomes, and Deshaun Watson, 2016 Paxton Lynch, 2014 Johnny Manziel and Teddy Bridgewater. Now, that's a little bit better, right? You have Allen and Mahomes are the only ones that were top 10 teams that traded up into the top 10 to get their guys at 8 and 10 respectively for Allen's and Mahomes. So, it seems like, waiting till the draft night, at least based off of the last decade, seems to be the best strategy moving forward. Now, trading up is a gamble, right? You're giving up potentially 2 or 3 years worth of draft assets for a player, especially at the quarterback position, that maybe has a 30 to 40% chance of hitting at best, right? And it leads to questions like, where would the 49ers be if they hadn't drafted Brock Purdy in 2022, or they hadn't kept Jimmy Garoppolo that year, right? After trading up for Trey Lance, would they have been playing in the Super Bowl this past year? Probably not. Depending on, whether or not you think Trey Lance would have gotten there. But, I don't think there's anything from this offseason that should cause anybody to sort of rethink how they think about the quarterback position. I think far too often, and this is especially true after Super Bowls, is that people tend to push certain narratives in sort of like, oh, this is how you build a successful team because the one team that won the Super Bowl built their team this way. And the reality of the NFL, and this is always going to be true, there is no one single master blueprint to success. There's no one size fits all sort of methodology for success. It's like all 32 teams have to look at things and what is the best interest for their team, right? For example, like you can look at a Jordan Love and, a lot of people are like, oh, well, does this mean that we can develop quarterbacks long-term nowadays? Maybe, sure. Like, that's always been the case in the NFL that, quarterbacks that take a little bit of extra seasoning, 3 years plus to develop, tend to work out pretty well. Right? At least over the last 20, 25 years. But that becomes less of a reality in today's NFL, right? And those circumstances that allow Jordan Love to be fostered in Green Bay are not circumstances that most NFL teams could repeat, right? Where you had at the time, a 36-year-old Aaron Rodgers, who had been one of the league's best quarterbacks, if not continued to be the league's best quarterback in the league, as this entrenched starter for a decade or more at that point in time. And, probably had I think 3 or 4 years left on his contract, but there was maybe some concern about decline, right? And so you drafted Jordan Love as a preemptive move, not because you thought, oh, Aaron Rodgers is going to be gone next year. It was like, okay, Aaron Rodgers could be gone in 2 or 3 years. And because Green Bay had done it before with Aaron Rodgers, it made sense for them to do it then. But if you look around the landscape currently in the NFL, there is no situation that would mimic that situation that had the Packers taking Jordan Love with an older Aaron Rodgers. The closest one would be the Rams with Matt Stafford. But if the Rams used their number one pick on a quarterback this year, I don't think anybody would be thinking, oh, he's going to sit on the bench for 3 years. It's like, oh yeah, because Matt Stafford's probably going to retire next year, right? So the closest equivalent to what the Packers had in 2020 when they drafted Jordan Love would arguably be the Chiefs taking a quarterback in round 1 with Patrick Mahomes, and Patrick Mahomes is 8 years younger than Aaron Rodgers. So it's one of those things where I think there's really the point being that it's just there is no sort of one size fits all, and sort of you can take lessons from it, but if it doesn't fit the situation that your team is in, it's whatever, you can only do what's the best case scenario for your there's no applicable lesson for the Falcons with Jordan Love, right? I mean, maybe there would be if they sign Kirk Cousins, but even then, Kirk Cousins is not, this established player in Atlanta like Aaron Rodgers was in Green Bay, So I hope that answers your question, Donnelly. Sorry for the delay in getting that question answered. But that's going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. Tomorrow we'll talk something. We got some guests coming up later in the week, but check out Locked On Falcons Insiders. The link, joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. Hit the link to join the Discord if you want to have your questions answered after a month of sitting in the mailbag like Donnelly did, as well as leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel.